Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, this is session two of the fifth topic titled European Colonialism, Old and New. Now, in this second session, we're going to continue looking at the old imperialism. There's still a few things to cover here regarding the effects of the old colonial societies or colonial empires. And after we cover that, we're going to be transitioning into part three to look at the rise of the industrial empires. That will be the new imperialism. All right, so let us turn to our outline. And just to remind you, at the end of session one, we were looking at the global effects of the old colonial systems. Particularly, we're looking at the effects it had in the Western Hemisphere. We were looking at a series of changes that transpired here, and the last portion of that had to do with the formulation of new kinds of societies, colonial societies, that are going to be organized around the idea of race. Again, so the idea of race is being introduced for the first time in global history here in the Western Hemisphere, as the societies were very, very diverse. We got, of course, European settlers coming from different parts of Europe. We got the Native American groups. There's a series of tribal groups, a great many of them, and also the African slaves that are being imported to work on the plantations. Now, at some point, this led to the issue as to for example, the Spanish Empire had a great debate. We were talking about that as to where the Native Americans came from. Again, this is going to lead to the idea of race. They were trying to determine whether the Native Americans belonged to the human family or not, because they were not mentioned in the Bible. So they had a great debate. Bartolomé de las Casas, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, again, two scholars in Spain, to debate this issue. And at the end of the day, it was determined that the natives were indeed human and they possessed a soul worth saving. So it was essential to send thousands of missionaries to the New World to convert them, to save them. But they were considered to be a separate kind of humanity, in other words, different kinds of humans, a different race, in other words. Okay. So again, this is really leading to the concept of race initially. And again, also, the formulation of the concept of race is going to arise out of the need to control colonial populations, because there was a series of colonial revolts. So there were slave revolts, for example. We were looking at that in Santo Domingo, for example, in South Carolina as well. And there were also uprisings, Native American uprisings, the Chichimec groups of Mexico fighting the Spaniards, for example. And in the colonial world of Great Britain, also, we see the Bacon's Rebellion. It was a rebellion from below, indentured servants, poor people, and of course, African servants coming together again to fight the colonists, and particularly the ruling class. Again, so this posed a problem to the imperial systems back in Europe as to how to actually govern colonies from afar, from far away. And this led to the need to kind of separate the colonist instead of, the colonists coming together, forming alliances with each other and gaining numbers and strength to declare independence. I mean, this is what, again, the imperial systems back in Europe kind of feared. What they decided was to separate people along the idea of race and give them a separate status, a separate position within a social hierarchy, different rights and duties, responsibilities, in other words, so they will not come together. In other words, so they will not form those alliances. So again, this led to this very artificial concept of race, a racial caste system that was implemented in the Spanish colonies. It was implemented in Brazil, in the Portuguese colony in South America. It was implemented also in the French colonies in the Caribbean, and also in the British colonies as well, including North America. In simple terms, again, they're pretty much separating people and pretty much granting them a separate racial identity, racial category. At the very top of the pyramid, we're going to see, of course, European born colonists, those born in Europe out of nobility. Those are members of the nobility born in Europe. They were granted the highest political offices in the colonies, whether those were, for example, the office of the governor, or the topmost positions of the church, for example. Again, so that is political power. And political power is vested in people that were born in Europe because they're faithful, again, to the mother country. Okay, and they were considered a separate race as well. I mean, this is very important for you to understand that they were considered a totally separate race of people. This is how artificial it is. It has no biological basis. Because even members of the nobility that were, in this case, born in America, they were American-born Europeans that had direct ties to nobility, they were granted a separate racial category, a separate identity. They were granted certain rights in the colonies, for example, owning land, again, and exercising certain offices within the church, for example, like the priesthood, for example, but not political power. And the idea is, well, if you were born in America, more than likely your loyalty, your attachment is with the colony, not with the mother country. So again, they deprived the American-born Europeans from political power, but they do enjoy significant privileges because they're going to become the landowners, the owners of the landed estates, plantations, haciendas, for example, and so on. So they will exercise economic power, but not political power. Okay. Below that caste, we're going to see another caste, and that is those of mixed ancestry, what they call mixed races, that had, European and African, for example, or European and Native American ancestry, the mixed races, and they were just below the landowners, in that they were not necessarily enjoying significant economic power nor political power, but they, to a certain degree, enjoy, for example, freedom of movement. They own just a little bit of land for them to, for example, engage in farming or cattle ranching. And they, more often than not, served as supervisors, for example, to the master class, in this case, the landed elite. Some of them actually served as house slaves. Again, they had that privilege that they were removed from the fields, okay, to work inside the house of the master. Okay, so below them would be the indigenous populations that were considered a separate race of people that were required to provide labor to all the caste members above them. Okay, whether those were the governors, for example, members of the church, or the landowners, and so on, even their supervisors and the like, they were there once again to provide tribute in terms of labor, crops, and the like. They were not necessarily enslaved; they were, again, just paying tribute in that fashion. And just below the hierarchy, at the very bottom of society, will be, of course, the slaves, and they constituted, in this case, the peoples that are brought from Africa in order to work in the plantations, for example, in the mines and the like. Again, so again, this is a social division of society along the idea of race. People are given a new identity, a new social identity, and that is racial identity, and they're kind of divided in that way. So that kind of prevented, to a certain degree, alliances between them, because each group was just trying to protect their own group at the expense of the others, in other words. Okay, if you're a member of the mixed race, for example, more than likely you don't want to create an alliance with indigenous peoples to revolt because, again, you are significantly better than the indigenous peoples below you, you know. And so, again, this is going to separate people on a psychological and emotional level, in that people will see separate, different from one another in that regard, because they perform different functions, they have different status, and so on, and they're trying to protect their own group. And to cement the system, those empires ban interracial marriage in order to prevent, once again, those people from building those kinds of links or bonds with one another as well. Again, this is part of the old colonialism. This is just give and take how the caste system looked like. Of course, there are variations and differences in the Spanish, English, Portuguese, and French social hierarchies, but this is, roughly speaking, you know, the kind of caste system that we see arising, you know, as we're moving into the 16 and into the 1700s. Now, the significance of this is that, again, this is really the beginning of racial identities. Prior to this time, people did not identify themselves as members of a race. Identity was really centered on the idea of kinship, tribal, for example, clan, lineage, also culture. People belong to certain linguistic groups, cultural groups, or religion. People belong to a certain faith. They associated themselves with members of the same religion, for example, but not with people that believe to be themselves as members of a separate race. But now, again, this is beginning to take root in world history. And remember that this system is artificially constructed, and it was constructed for the purpose of controlling colonial society from afar. Again, trying to separate, again, the colonists, in other words, in that way. So it was really the concept of race was introduced in human history about 4 centuries ago, so as a social control mechanism. In other words, a social control mechanism. Again, that is the main purpose, again, of the concept of race, and this is how it's been used ever since, by the way. Okay, it's a social control mechanism, and the consequence of that is that since peoples that are brought from Africa are relegated this position to serve as slaves, from this point onwards, slavery will be associated with race, particularly those people that are coming from Africa. Again, so this is going to be the consequence of this new kind of racial caste system, is that from this point onwards in human history, you know, slavery will be associated with race, because before, slavery was never associated with race. No, it was, again, something that people practiced even within communities. People enslaved one another, even within members of the same village, for example. Europeans enslaved other Europeans, and Africans enslaved other Africans. Middle Easterners enslaved other Middle Easterners, Native Americans, other Native Americans, and so on. But now, again, the idea is that people that are exported out of Africa forcefully, again, those are the peoples that are going to be in that position. In other words, in society, particularly in colonial societies in the Western Hemisphere. All right, so let us look at part three, and part three is going to look at the new colonialism. So we have covered quite extensively the old colonialism, and that was essential because this was the beginning stages of European colonialism. It all started in the Western Hemisphere with the Plantation Empires. Okay. Now, the new colonialism will give rise to new kinds of empires that, although they are still going to rely to a certain degree on the production of cash crops, this is not going to go away. They're going to rely more and more on the extraction, as we'll see, of natural resources or raw materials in order to build and fuel their emerging industries. Okay, so this is, again, something that is taking place in Europe, something we covered in the previous topic when we're looking at the age of revolutions, for example. It is that Europe is going through an industrial revolution, something that starts, roughly speaking, around 1750 in England, okay, or Great Britain. And so we see the rapid spread of industrialization, first in England or Great Britain. And from Great Britain, the Industrial Revolution will be spreading into other areas of Europe, mainly Holland, France, and Germany, particularly as we're moving into the 19th century or the 1800s. Okay, so we see the building of new kinds of economies that are not going to rely exclusively on the production of agricultural products. Again, Europe is moving into a new direction. Again, they're building industrial economies. They're building industries, factories, and they're now manufacturing textiles, steel, for example, iron, and they're going to pretty much mechanize production. So everything that was required in society, again, will be produced by the use of machinery. Okay, so we're seeing the rise of something new. It's a whole new system altogether. And the economies are changing at the same time because, once again, economic growth will be determined by the amount of manufactured goods coming out of steel plants or factories, etc., and the ability to actually sell those products not only within the country, but also outside as well. Again, so this is going to spur economic development. Again, industrial production. Okay, so this is, again, very essential because this is going to change the nature not only of the European economic system, but also their imperial systems at the same time. Now, keep in mind that this industrial revolution, particularly as we're moving into the 19th century, mainly, is also giving rise to new technologies. Again, this is really the machine age. So there's great effort for European scientists to invest in new kinds of machines to produce a wide array of different products, to process, manufacture products, or to transport goods. Again, and some of those technologies are going to put to use in the world of warfare. They're going to be used as, in other words, military technologies to make war more effective, more efficient, okay, more mechanized, more industrial in this regard. Okay, for example, although we talked about, for example, the steam engine that was used to propel steamships and railroads. Again, that was needed to carry out industrialization. I mean, you need to be moving large loads of natural resources, whether it's coal or iron ore, steel, etc. From the mines to the steel plants and the like, manufactured goods need to be also mobilized and sold and so on. And that's what, again, the use for the railroads and steamboats were all about. But at the same time, railroads and steamboats can be used for military purposes as well. Now you have the ability to move troops faster than ever to far-flung areas of the globe, by the use of steamboats, for example. Okay, you can mobilize your imperial army and defend territories, or perhaps engage in warfare, invade, new lands, then take control of them and the like. What is called, military expansion, in other words. Okay, that's where the railroads also fulfill, as we'll see when those empires, the European empires, the industrial empires, are beginning to move into different areas of the world. Particularly, they're moving to Africa. They're moving into the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, Asia proper, the Middle East. They're going to bring with them the railroad. And part of that had to do with, of course, the extraction of minerals, agricultural products, natural resources, again, to be shipped back to the mother country, but also to ensure control. Again, that they want to, move troops within those lands in order to ensure more and more control. Okay, uh, they're also developing artillery, long range artillery, for example, technologies that will enable those imperial armies to overwhelm the more traditional type of weaponry that other societies are still using at this time, that is not necessarily that sophisticated or mechanized. Again, so even warfare is becoming more and more mechanized, during this time. The early stages of what we today call the machine gun, for example. Okay, the early stages of that again is beginning in the 19th century. Okay, so this is going to give the Europeans a great advantage that they are indeed using industrial level technologies in order to move around the globe and ensure control, again, to areas that are geographically rich, resources and the like, and also, of course, as we'll see, markets. Now, we also see in the 19th century the innovation of other technologies like the telegraph, for example, the telephone, newspapers. Okay, I mean, those are actually inventions of the 19th century, telecommunications in this case. And this is also going to facilitate the development of the new kind of empire, the industrial empire, because now communication is beginning to travel faster and faster than ever. Okay, uh, so one of the problems that the old empires faced is that whenever there was a rebellion, the news didn't travel that fast. It would take months for the empire, the core back in Europe, to receive a report that in a faraway province, in a colony, again, in the Western Hemisphere, for example, there was a rebellion. So by the time they organize themselves and dispatch a force to put out the rebellion, it will take, again, another 3, 4, 6 months. So again, this really was one of the main difficulties of the old empires. But now, because of the telegraph, because of the telephone, again, empires will receive instantaneous communication, reports, briefs about their colonies overseas, despite the fact that they were on the other end of the world. And there will be fast, or the very extremely fast communication, fast information awareness about what transpired in the colonies, and of course the empires are going to act very promptly, okay, to resolve those rebellions. Again, newspapers also were used by the empires to inform their own colonists about what the empire was creating, the new laws, for example, taxes and the like. And of course, also was not just the source of information. Newspapers also served as a form of propaganda as well, again, for the colonial world as well. So this is a tool, those are actually tools of empire, whether we're talking about steamboats, railroads, artillery, the telegraph, the telephone, and newspapers. Those were the new tools of the industrial empires. Okay. Now, those industrial empires have certain requirements, to fulfill their industrial goals. If you are trying to create an industrial economy based on growth, well, you're going to have to feed your industries with the required raw materials. Again, so you need things like, for example, coal and iron ore to industrialize. That's just so basic. Again, for the steel plants, steel production, iron for the development of railroads, factories, machines, bridges, you name it. Again, that is key. You need also zinc, copper, for example, rubber, lumber, including cotton. Again, cotton is essential for the development of the textile industry, which was really the starter of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. It was really textile manufacturing. So those are going to be the raw materials that the Europeans are pursuing at this point. And they're going to have to move out of Europe because in many cases, with very few exceptions, for example, when you look, for example, at Great Britain, I mean, they do have a geographical advantage. They do have a lot of coal. Again, there are iron ore deposits in Central Europe, in certain areas of Eastern France, for example, West Germany. Again, yeah, but Europe is not really that rich in resources, so they're going to have to move out of the continent in pursuit of those resources in order to carry out their industrial projects. And they also need markets, because once you manufacture those goods, textiles and iron, etc., you're going to have to also make sure that your economy continues growing by engaging in this massive market economy, trying to sell your products as fast as possible within your country. And when you exhaust your own domestic market, you must pursue foreign markets, foreign consumers, that is to say. So this is going to lead to colonialism, because what the Europeans are going to be looking for is colonies to get the raw materials, but also to sell their products as well, those foreign markets. Okay. And they're going to look at the world map, and they're going to be tapping, of course, into areas of the globe that we know that resources are abundant, whether we're talking about lumber, for example, or rubber, whether we're talking about iron ore and coal, etc. Again, the Europeans, by the way, are actually sending scientists, explorers, and pioneers all over the world in order to engage in this so-called reconnaissance mission, in order to detect resources in different parts of the world, provide a report, and of course, move into those areas. And the way they're going to be moving into those areas is by coming into those areas, as we'll see, in terms of trying to invest in development. Again, it's called investment abroad. Okay, investors, they will come in with capital, for example, scientists, engineers, and so on. In many cases, those are companies, trading companies, given access to certain areas to develop things like mining, for example, industries in those areas for the extraction of those minerals, for example, and to develop commercial agriculture, and also what they call infrastructure development. They're trying to, in other words, one of the ideas that they present to other societies, non-Western societies, is that they're there to develop their economies, to develop their societies, their countries. In other words, look, we're here to build railroads, for example. Okay, we're bringing the telegraph, we're bringing the telephone, for example, telecommunications. We're going to modernize your ports. They're going to be modern, totally efficient. This is going to facilitate trade. You're going to benefit from that, and so on. No, we're bringing progress. In other words, okay, we are bringing progress to your area. Okay, it's going to be transformed completely again. So we're, in other words, they're serving as agents of modernity. They're trying to bring modernity, into other societies. But what they're actually doing in this process is just laying out the foundations for a colonial world that is going to feed the mother country. In other words, yes, they're going to be building mining industries, plantations, landed estates for the production of cash crops, etc. Railroads, ports, telecommunications. But all of this will be used for the extraction, once again, of resources out of those countries and to facilitate that, in other words. Okay, so that was part of this new imperialism. This development is taking place. It's true, but again, it's just to facilitate imperialism. Okay. All right. So as we're going to be looking at areas of the world that the Europeans are beginning to colonize, keep in mind that as a preamble to colonization, this is a new type of colonization again. Keep in mind that whether we're going to be looking, for example, at India, or we're going to be looking at Southeast Asia, or we're going to be looking at Africa, or the Middle East and China, those are the areas we're going to be looking at. There's a certain pattern, that doesn't apply exactly the same way to every area of the world that the Europeans are about to colonize in this new phase of colonialism. But it is very consistent that the way the Europeans are embarking upon this project of colonization is that almost in every area, they seem to follow a certain pattern, okay, that shares certain common characteristics, common features with one another, although there are variations, between each one of them. They're not all identical. There's a certain variation, but again, there's also certain commonalities as well. For example, they seem to, first and foremost, get involved initially in the local politics of the region. They arrive there first as supplicants for trade. They arrive with their trading companies in order to be granted certain access to coastal regions, to have access to, for example, a port, for them to engage in trade. They are granted permission. In many cases, they pay tribute to the local authorities, the local princes or rulers, etc. And because of their technologies, particularly the military technologies that they bring, they're beginning to engage in certain negotiations with the local rulers. The local rulers like to benefit, in other words, from the military technologies that the Europeans bring. I mean, that's a fact. And as the European rulers provide that assistance in order to be granted more and more trading concessions, we're going to see a symbiotic, of course, relationship between the local rulers and the Europeans. But over time, the local rulers, the native rulers, will grow more and more dependent on European support. The local rulers are depending on the Europeans for weapons, for loans, for military assistance, or diplomatic recognition within their own societies, because there will be rivalries between them and so on, the local rulers. And again, this is going to enhance the power of the European powers, again, in those societies, as they're going to become more and more essential for the stability of those societies. And that stability cannot really be maintained because as the Europeans bring in their weapons, again, into those societies are now acquiring, very advanced military technologies, and they engage in conflict and warfare, amongst themselves. So this really creates a lot of instability in those societies. Again, social destabilization. And this social destabilization, in the end, opens up opportunities for the Europeans to take more and more control of the region. Okay, this is the kind of model that we're going to be looking at, again, as we're going to be looking at, once again, India and Southeast Asia, Africa, and the like. Again, it's kind of the kind of pattern, again, that gets repeated in different forms, in different ways, but it's pretty much the idea. Okay. All right. So let's start with India. And India, as we'll see, will be colonized by Great Britain. It will be totally transformed, particularly as we reach the 19th century. Again, it will be formally a British colony, and perhaps the most important one. If you recall, India um, was not colonized immediately by the British when the British arrived back in the early 1600s. They formed a trading company. The most important trading company for the British Empire was the British East India Company. They gained certain concessions by the local princes of India, particularly in Calcutta, for example, Madras, Bengal, for example. And they were there just to engage in trade. Okay. During the 1600s, India was ruled by an empire. It should be noted, it was the Mughal Empire, again, which is Islamic. Okay, it was an Islamic empire. They conquered India in the 1500s, early 1500s. This is a group of peoples that were Turks and Mongols. They had a Turkish and Mongol background. They converted to Islam and they conquered India, and they were ruling India since the early 1500s. So when the British arrived very early on in the early 1600s, I mean, they're not there to conquer the territory and take over. Okay, I mean, they couldn't. They just didn't have the resources. They didn't have the forces, the numbers. Again, so they're there just to engage in trade, and they were welcome because that was part of the policy of the Mughal Empire, is to welcome merchants from around the world in order to enhance international trade, to produce more for exports, and that will benefit the Mughal Empire. Okay. Now, remember that India was considered really, the grand prize of the European trading empires, just because this is the place that produced, for example, sugar, it produced cotton, it produced teas, raw silk, for example, jute, black pepper, spices, and the like. I mean, this is how and why the international economy was consolidated. Remember, after Marco Polo returned from his journey from the Far East in the late 1200s. Again, India was considered to be this heaven. Again, for merchants in Europe, it was just, the grand prize. Whoever will control the Indian trade will control the world economy. That's as the saying went back then. So again, this led the Europeans to actually build technologies in order to develop a trade route to reach the Indies, again, India, the Indian Ocean, for the spice trade. So ever since really, the 1300s, the Europeans have set their eyes totally on India. The Portuguese arrived there first, in the early 1500s. They're followed by the French, who also developed trading outposts in south of India, and then of course the British. And the Indian merchants were producing massive products, again, through of course, the effort of artisans and peasants and the like. They're engaged in this massive export of goods, and this really was the source of the wealth of India. All those agricultural products had a market in the world economy, and also cotton textiles as well. Remember, this is leading to Indian manufacturing as well, even within India, as Indian textiles are becoming more and more in vogue in Europe. The French and the British are exporting massive quantities of that. Okay. So what the British are learning is that, this region is extremely rich. is geographically is gigantic. It has, abundant resources, raw materials that can feed their growing industries, particularly as we're going to look at the British Industrial Revolution that is beginning to start in the late 16, early 1700s. Again, and also because it has a large population, the British are also quite interested in India because can India can potentially also absorb the excess uh, manufactured goods, the surplus uh, uh, products coming out of the textile factories back in England, for example. Okay, so again, potentially this is a place that uh, can aid Great Britain in its industrial project uh, because this is going to accelerate industrial production and economic growth at the same time. Okay, if they can only colonize India. Now, at this time, the British are in India, but more specifically, it is the members of the British East India Company. They're the ones that were welcomed by the Mughal Empire. They were granted certain concessions, certain ports, and so on. And again, it is really the company that is there. Again, so this is not really again, British officials or a British army. As a matter of fact, uh, you know, at this time, Britain doesn't have such a massive force to engage in imperial conquest at this time, and they just don't have the numbers. Um, so the way they're going to build an army in India is that they're going to recruit what we today we call mercenaries. Okay, mercenaries. Again, they're transitioning from a simple trading company that were just the clients of the Mughal Empire to a company that will be well armed, that will have their own imperial army within India. And they're recruiting natives. Again, they're recruiting people within India. Those mercenaries, those military recruits will be known as the sepoys, the sepoy army. No. So you might ask why is it that the indigenous population of India, accept this kind of job, mercenary? Well, because they paid well. The company paid very, very well. And when opportunities were lacking, for example, or land was lacking, etc., you know, uh, indigenous societies in different parts of the world saw it convenient to serve, for example, the interest of a trading company that was willing to offer them, of course, sustenance, a job, etc., status, and the opportunity to, move upward in the social ladder as well. Again, so that was an opportunity to do that, okay, from their own perspective. So again, we see this in the company becoming more and more um, strengthened. They are acquiring a force in their own right, and at some point, they're going to use that force to intervene in the local affairs of Indian society within the Mughal Empire. And as a matter of fact, the Mughal Empire is going to face a crisis, what's called an imperial crisis. Okay, this crisis begins in the 1600s, and it begins as a result of the Little Ice Age I talked about in session one. Okay, this is affecting peasants around the world. Agricultural production is hindered by this cooling weather around the world, and we see, of course, drought, for example, which leads to starvation in many cases. There's, of course, this disease or certain epidemics also affecting the peasant population. And at the same time, there is a conflict arising within India, and that is religious conflict. Because the rulers, the Mughals, are Muslim, and they constitute a minority. I mean, all the administrators, as a matter of fact, of the Mughal Empire constitute a tiny fraction, a tiny minority of the overall population, which are Hindu. So there are, of course, religious tensions brewing as we're moving into the 16 and 1700s. This religious division, compounded by the problems of agriculture, failures, and so on, the drought, and so on, leads to a series of peasant rebellions. So again, there's a rebellion brewing from below. The Mughal rulers are facing, of course, now opposition by the native peasantry, the Hindus, in other words, and this is going to destabilize, the region. Now, this is further compounded by a rivalry between two elite groups within India. On one hand, those were the Hindu Samarins, though the Hindu Samarins were the local princes. Those were actually members of the Indian caste system, the warrior caste. Those were actually chieftains or warriors that controlled certain territories, certain principalities, for example. They were called the Samarins. And on the other hand were the Mughal administrators called the Mansadvars. Those were the kind of like the conquistadors or the conquerors that came with the Mughals to conquer India. And in order to reward their service for having conquered India, they were awarded land. But the Mansadvars were shifted constantly from region to region. They were given the right to remain in a region for a while and extract tribute from the population. But in order to avoid the Mansadvars developing certain ties and loyalties with a region, they were shifted and they were moved from place to place. So one of the things that the Mansadvars were trying to do was to kind of extract as much tribute as possible from the population, because they didn't know that in the next region that they were to be assigned, they were not going to face, the kind of abundant resources there. So they were kind of exploitative, in other words. Whereas the Samarins were not exploitative. They were very loyal to the people. They were Hindus in this case. They were members of their, of the caste system that had certain obligations towards the other members of the caste. And we see tensions brewing between those two groups out of political reasons and also religious reasons. And the peasantry is growing more and more agitated at the fact that the Mansadvars are pretty much trying to increase the number of goods to be paid as tribute or taxes again. And this is really just leading to more and more crises from within. So at some point, those two groups will become the leaders of a massive war. They're trying to pretty much out one another. And this is when the British East India Company comes in and forms an alliance with one side. In this case, the Samarins. The Hindu princes, those chieftains, actually made a deal with the company that they wanted assistance, they wanted arms and monies in order to combat the Mansadvars. And of course, the company throws their favor on one side. And again, this is leading to a major battle, the Battle of Plassey in 1757. It was between the Hindu Samarins and the Mughal Mansadvars again, and the East India Company is in the middle of that, supporting one side, of course. And of course, the Mansadvars, the Mughals, end up losing the battle, and this is leading by 1757 to the rapid disintegration of the Mughal Empire in India. And the British East India Company is now seizing the opportunity to fill the void, because now there's a power vacuum in India. This imperial force, this imperial administration, the Mughal Empire is disintegrating, and the East India Company is going to fill this place, in other words, okay? And they're going to start ruling now more directly certain regions of India, for example, Bengal. Not all of India. They start with the northeastern part of the Indian subcontinent, Bengal, as you can see, the Bay of Bengal. And slowly but surely, as we're going to be moving into the 19th century, the East India Company will begin expanding its control over large portions of the India subcontinent eventually, as we'll see, particularly toward the latter part of the 19th century. India will become part of the British Empire. Again, this is gradual uh, territorial expansion and conquest, by the company. And of course, what the company is doing now is building tens of thousands of miles of railroads, building also the telegraph for the purpose of tightening together all the Indian subcontinent for the purpose of dispatching, of course, troops and forces in order to put down rebellions and the like, again, to gain more and more imperial control, that is to say. Okay? So in 1786, however, we see back in London a certain reform that is going to lead to the gradual colonization of India by London and not necessarily by the British East India Company. And that was the Act of 1786. And what the Act of 1786 did was to subordinate the East India Company to the Crown of England. So instead of the company ruling India directly, what is happening now is that slowly but surely now the Crown is controlling the company in order to control India. So the company is still in the middle, again, still not yet, again, out of the way. The effects of British rule is that the Hindu princes, who are known as the Zamindars, for example, are transformed into new commercial landowners. Okay, so this is what the British Empire is trying to do: develop commercial agriculture, plantations for growing cash crops for exports for the British. So they're introducing a new economic model, the plantation itself. So they're transforming the Hindu princes, otherwise known as the Zamindars, into plantation owners. In other words, okay, as a new commercial landowner, you're gonna own this plantation, and you're gonna bring in people to work in the plantation to grow things like sugar and cotton, etc. Again, for exports for the British. So they're really transforming India's colonial economy to be geared totally for exports, particularly to ship everything to England. Again, so England is really taking control of India's economy. Now, India is really functioning as a de facto colony in that they're serving now the interests, the needs of the mother country. Again, so they're growing coffee, cotton, for example, jute, in plantations. Again, so now they're developing, again, European style plantations, the kind of plantations we saw, for example, in the Western Hemisphere. So this is the same process that is entering now India, the kind of colonial plantations, in other words, okay? In this process of building the new plantations, for example, peasants will be losing land because those lands were privatized. They were placed in the hands of a planter class, and they were forced, in other words, to provide tribute, to work the land for a planter. Again, so they're transforming the peasantry that had some form of control over their lives and their land and their crops now to be just a workforce. Again, just, for example, peons, for example. A peon is somebody that must work for a master in order to clear a certain debt, for example, to clear a debt. So they're being granted loans, for example, monies. They're acquiring a certain debt, and in order to clear the debt, they're being pushed into the plantations, to work for a master. In this case, this is also going to have the consequence of wiping out India's domestic manufacturing base. That was significant. It was one of the largest economies in the world based on the export of textiles. And again, the British are pretty much taking over the manufacturing system of India, dismantling it, because now what they want is for the peoples of India to buy and consume British textiles manufactured back in England. Okay, so this is eventually going to lead to the total disintegration of India's domestic manufacturing again. So they're now importing, British textiles. They're being forced to actually import British textiles. And at the same time, Britain is sending Christian missionaries to convert the Hindus and the Muslims to Christianity. And this is going to lead to more and more religious tensions within India. Eventually, out of all of those issues, we're going to see a massive rebellion against the British in 1857. It was called the Sepoy Rebellion. Those were the mercenaries, the military recruits of the East India Company. They're going to now stage a major revolt against the company and against the British in general for the loss of land, the loss of rights, the laws of the manufacturing base and the like. Again, so there's a multiplicity of different groups, native groups coming together, and they're staging this massive rebellion against the British, called the Sepoy Rebellion, against British rule. Now, the British will suppress the rebellion, but the end result was that now in India is going to be ruled directly by London. In other words, the crown finally, the British Empire made the reform that from this point onwards, the British East India Company must get out of the way. They kind of blamed the rebellion on the company, and now they're building a colonial government in which London will be ruling the colony more directly. And one of the ways that they're trying to build a colonial society here is by what is called westernizing the Indian mind, trying to bring in Western education, European values, European ideas, for example, about capitalism, progress, for example, individualism, rationalism, all of the ideas we saw, in the age of revolutions, to educate the Indian mind, to transform the native, to become more and more European. And they're educating the native elite. In other words, they're starting with the native elite. They're teaching them English, and they're teaching them, of course, Western values. And now they are introducing the idea that India needs to become like Europe because, Europeans have a certain ethic, a work ethic. They work very hard to develop their societies. They progress materially by their efforts, by creating enterprises, etc., investment and the like, technologies, scientific innovation and the like. And they bring in the idea again that the English are really the superior type of European that the native Indians should emulate. They call themselves the English mad dogs, for example, that, the English are, the alpha male, for example. They're extremely, dominant, and they're determined, they're courageous. They can conquer nature, they can transform their lives, they can transform the environment through hard work, for example. And they developed the idea that one of the reasons why India is lagging behind in this so-called material progress is because people in India are effeminate, particularly the men, for example. Okay, so this is a bias against women, considering women as to be weak, irrational, for example. And they're calling, of course, the Indian men effeminate, that they're effeminate, that they don't have that kind of courage in order to conquer the world, in other words, like the English. So they're trying to change, in other words, the Indian mind by introducing those kinds of values. Now, in Southeast Asia, we're going to see the Dutch moving into one region and colonizing, gaining control of that region. And that is, again, the Spice Islands, particularly the island of Java, for example. We saw in an earlier topic how the Dutch moved into some of those islands very aggressively, back in the 1600s, early 1600s, trying to control the production of spices, trying to control prices. And they engage in something called relocation of populations, moving people from one island to another, relocating them because they were mass producing and affecting prices. And when that didn't work, they will just outright annihilate populations again. So they were, quite aggressive in that regard. But in particular, the Dutch are now trying to control the Southeast Asian trade routes altogether, and they're going to colonize, particularly one of the most important islands, and that was the island of Java, and they're going to be taking over that island. They also create their own East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. They initially arrive there as supplicants, trying to just, gain some concessions. They're paying tribute to the rulers, the sultans of Mataram. Again, this is really, again, the government of the island, the native government. They're the sultans of Mataram. And just like in India, we're going to see the intervention of the company in local politics. In 1670, there's a crisis of succession. The sultanate, of course, that was dying had a series of sons, all claiming, rights, entitlements to be the heirs to the throne. So there are siblings, in other words, that are trying to compete with one another, fighting with each other in order to gain the throne, and they request the assistance of the company for help, military aid, in other words, weaponry, ships, for example, loans, aid, etc., so they can be, the next heir to the throne, pretty much impose their will by force and oust their siblings, again, from power. Again, so as the company is throwing their support to one of those siblings, there's going to be a growing dependency, uh, on the European assistance. The next sultans, starting around 1670, will grow more and more dependent on the aid, the diplomatic recognition, the protection, the loans, again, that the Dutch bring in. Again, and in return, what the Dutch request is more and more economic concessions. In other words, again, yeah, we are giving you all this support, but we want something back, and that is we want more and more trading rights, perhaps control of the market within your society, land, and so on. Again, so slowly but surely, the company was taking over again the island. Their navy, their weapons, which were used to sustain the local elites, will be used at some point to take over the company, to take over the island of Java by 1750. So by 1750, the island of Java is in total Dutch control by this point. The Europeans will also be moving into another area, and that is Africa. Again, this is far more significant. And this is where we're going to see another chapter of the new imperialism, in which the Europeans will engage in this massive territorial expansion and the takeover, again, of territories and building a series of colonial systems, in the African continent. And this is something that gradually started out, back during the days of the slave trade, this early imperialism, when, the Europeans, starting with the Portuguese in the 15th century, are moving into the west coast of Africa, and they're building commercial partnerships with different kingdoms of the region. And there is a symbiotic relationship and alliance between the African kingdoms and the European powers. And what this symbiotic alliance was all about is that they're providing, of course, military aid for slaves. Okay, military aid for slaves. In other words, the Europeans bring in weaponry, gunpowder, muskets, and so on, horses as well to the African kingdoms, and in return, the African kingdoms exchange that for slaves. Now, during this early form of imperialism in Africa, the Europeans do not have any kind of success building colonies within Africa itself. Not that they didn't want to do that or that they didn't try. They indeed tried, but they failed over and over again. And that was a result of malaria or disease, in other words, tropical diseases that affected the Europeans in a very severe way. So anytime the Europeans established some settlements, and tried to build a colony in West Africa. By the 10th year, by the decade, that colony was gone because of malaria, for example. So they tried colonizing it, but it failed over and over again. One of the kingdoms, again, in this very early stage of imperialism, that had very close relationships with the Portuguese was the Kingdom of the Congo, something we talked about in the past. The Portuguese, developed very strong relationships with this kingdom to the point that the monarchs of the Kingdom of Congo were adopting many of the European systems of government, for example. Okay, for example, King Afonso, who ruled Congo, he himself changed his name to a Portuguese name to begin with, and he adopted the succession system of Europe of inheriting, passing on the power of the ruler to the oldest male, to the eldest male. Okay? Whereas in the past, the tradition was that you needed to pass the throne to a nephew in order to strengthen the king group, in other words, to allow, members or relatives within the tribal society to also share power. Afonso also converted to Catholicism, and he was the founder of the very first Catholic Church in Congo as well. Again, so he was engaging in this process of guns for slaves, for example, which led to new kinds of military campaigns, within Africa, and that the African kingdoms were now conducting open raids, in other words, in the interior of the continent to secure more and more slaves to be traded for guns, because the idea was for the ruler to enhance its power at the expense of their neighbors by acquiring this technology that the Europeans were bringing. And this really destabilized the region as well. It created a lot of instability. So much so that in 1622, the Portuguese invaded Congo. Just how unstable the Kingdom of the Congo became because of the internal rivalries between the different warring kingdoms. Again, it kind of weakened the kingdom, and the Portuguese are beginning to take more and more, control. To the point that by 1678, the Kingdom of the Congo totally collapsed. It disintegrates. Still, up to this point, European colonization is not totally successful due to disease as well. It continues to hinder European colonization. Okay, so keep that in mind. Again, the Europeans are trying to gain control of the region. It's just that it's not possible at this point. There's another area that is destabilized, and it kind of provides opportunities, for the Europeans to gain more and more control as well, and that is the Gold Coast. Again, you can see here in this map, the Gold Coast, in this region right here. Okay, and what we see is that initially, when the Europeans arrived, they engaged in trade with the local tribal leaders. Those were leaders of the king groups, in other words, and they traded, once again, weaponry for slaves, similarly to what happened with Congo as well. But over time, as this trade proceeded, this led to the disintegration of those tribal organizations. And this led to new kinds of rulers, a new ruling elite. Because what actually happened is that with this new weaponry that the Europeans were introducing in Africa, we're going to see the rise of strongmen. Those were actually chieftains or warriors that were forming their own armies. And in many cases, their armies were made up of slaves as well, and they're armed. And they're being commanded by this quote unquote merchant prince. So there's a new ruling elite on the rise. Again, we're no longer seeing the kind of king leaders or tribal leaders engaging in negotiations with the Europeans, but rather those are merchant princes. And now power is not really based on kinship anymore. Again, this is not, the source of the authority of the individual that is controlling the region. It is really military force. Who has the weapons, in other words? Who has the numbers? Who has their own personal slave army? In this case, those are going to be the individuals that are going to be controlling local politics and dealing with the Europeans as well. There are, of course, certain groups that are emerging as the new ruling elite in the Gold Coast. People like January Connie, for example, who was also known as John Connie as well, was one of member of this African society that really builds an army of his own with his new weapons, and he's really a power broker with the Europeans. He's using his slave armies to raid the interior part of Africa, to capture more and more populations, to bring them to the coast again, to be traded for more and more weapons. Okay, the Ashanti as well. The Ashanti is another group of rulers that are also controlling the region by forming their own slave armies as well that are very, very well armed because there are new technologies now again. So those groups were both allies with the Europeans, but at times they also were rivals as well. I mean, they're really a force to reckon with. The Europeans don't have an easy time with them, that they're arming them. So at times, again, what those native groups are going to do is that they're going to turn around and use those armies to combat the Europeans. And this is going to lead to regional warfare, not necessarily between the Europeans and those new rulers, but even those rulers are fighting with each other over supremacy, over trade. They want to get the access to those technologies that the Europeans bring, the horses and the weapons and the like, and they're fighting with one another. So this creates really a lot of instability in the Gold Coast. So the region is disintegrating once again because of regional warfare as well. Again, this is very important. And another change that this is leading to is that more and more the tribal groups in the interior of Africa that bore many names, different tribal identities, etc., they're all lumped together under a single kind of identity. They're known as the Igos. The Igos were simply the slaves, in other words. In other words, just members of different tribal communities and villages, etc., in the interior, they were all called slaves. In other words, potential slaves to be raided, captured, to be traded for weapons at the same time. So again, this leads to the further disintegration, again, of Africa, which is going to lead to this new phase of imperialism, which is really, again, a phase where the Europeans are gaining more and more control, and colonizing the region more directly and ruling it, again, more directly as well. Part of this, and this is something that occurs in the late 19th century, why the Europeans are now colonizing, they're moving into Africa and pretty much taking control of all of Africa, had to do with the fact that Europe is losing all of their colonial possessions in the Western Hemisphere. There are waves and waves of colonial revolutions, like the 13 colonies in 1776, the Spanish colonies from 1810 onwards. One by one, they're freeing themselves from Europe. So Europe doesn't have, in other words, the ability to extract resources from America anymore. Another thing is that the slave trade is coming to an end as we're moving into 1870. It's declared illegal. So the slave trade comes to an end. And so as this very lucrative, profitable trade comes to an end, the Europeans are trying to find new ways of acquiring wealth. And because they're building their economies based on industries, manufacturing and the like, well, they resolved that, well, since the slave trade is coming to an end, now there's a quest for minerals. There's a quest for lumber, ivory, palm oil, and so on, something we can acquire, in this case, from Africa, not from America, but from Africa again. So this is going to be now the home of this new colonial stage, on this new imperialism. There's also development of a new treatment for malaria. It's called quinine. Okay, quinine, again, is really the kind of antidote for malaria. And now the Europeans will have at their disposal medicine, a treatment to combat malaria. So therefore, they're going to feel more at ease at colonizing Africa. So they're going to be moving, more forcefully into that continent, and they're going to be pretty much establishing a series of colonies. And while they're doing that, trying to extract minerals and agricultural products to feed their industries, they're also going to try to bring so-called progress, trying to acculturate as well Africa, building certain education systems for the native elite. Again, this is not really the kind of massive public school system, to educate the masses, but rather just a native elite, again, to start really westernizing their mind, just like in India, for example, sending Christian missionaries to convert them to Christianity. Again, so they will be now accepting the Christian, faith that was the European faith, thereby accelerating the process of assimilation, and of course introducing also clinics, modern medicine at the same time, introducing Western, in other words, technologies, Western ideas. Again, so people will leave behind their ancestral traditional methods of dealing with, disease and, etc. So this leads to the partition of Africa in 1885. There's a conference in Berlin whereby all the imperial systems in Europe meet in order to discuss, who is going to get what, in other words. So there's going to be pretty much a conference that spanned from 1884 to 1885 in which they are really dividing, Africa like a pie and pretty much assigning each European power a region that they will colonize and exploit at the same time. Of course, so those are the regions, as you can see in this map. The French are in northwestern Africa. The British pretty much develop a region, across eastern Africa from the north all the way to the south, etc. And again, what they're trying to do is extract, resources out of the continent to be shipped to Europe to fuel their industries. Again, so the French colonized Africa. They're granted certain concessions, what is called Algeria, Morocco, parts of the sub-Saharan desert, as well as you can see, all the areas you can see here in blue are part of the French colonial system. And the way the French are colonizing Africa, at least from a political point of view, is that they're trying to rule Africa directly. This is called direct rule, ruling Africa by virtue of, passing laws, back in Paris, the capital in France, that will have to be enforced by colonial governors. In other words, that, yeah, they're going to be colonial governors that will be following orders, the rules, the norms, the trade laws, etc., the colonial laws, again, emitted by Paris. They're also, engaged in trying to westernize also the African mind. Cultural assimilation for them is essential. They're trying to, in other words, introduce the French language, the French religion. The Catholic missionaries are moving into the region in order to convert the natives as well, and trying to create this idea that the colonists were, really French citizens, in other words, that they were not really, in other words, members of their tribal group, trying to pretty much break that apart, that tribal, identification, and instead trying to build a cultural citizenship, in other words, that you are a member of this culture of France, in other words, French values, French language, the religion, and the like, the science as well, Western science over your traditional science, abandoning the spirits, all those traditions, praying to the spirits of the land and so on. And, they're starting also by trying to train or indoctrinate a small native elite. Once again, they're really just like in India, in other words, very similarly, they're trying to educate, just a handful of people, the leaders, the tribal leaders, in other words, to westernize them, to make them more like the French. So they will return to their villages, to their localities, and spread those values as well, to kind of create this cultural citizenship. And they're also transforming the economy of those societies in that they're becoming more and more export led, building cotton plantations to export massive quantities of cotton to France to fuel the French industries, this textile manufacturing back in France, and also minerals as well. So they have, of course, a series of mining industries, mining operations, and this is what the French are doing, at this point. Now, we have run out of time. When we come back, we're going to proceed by looking at other areas of Africa that were colonized, in this case by Great Britain, also Belgium as well. And after we do that, we're going to be looking at the Middle East and China. And once we cover that, then the remaining portion of session 3 will be devoted to colonial resistance. Again, how those colonial societies responded, in other words, to European colonialism and imperialism. Okay, all of that will be explained when we come back in session 3. This is all I have for you. Thank you.